All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Anderson, and I'm in the State 4-H Livestock Program Specialist for Iowa State University Extension and Outreach for the 4-H Youth Development Program. I'm housed here in the State 4-H office in Ames and have been in my current position for, I think it'll be 15 years this spring in March. So it's been quite a while and it's gone fast. What I'm going to try and do here is share my screen, so hopefully you can all see that. I'll probably have a tough time monitoring the chat room, but as I get done, feel free. There is a chat pod or button there at the bottom of your screen, should be. If you have questions or comments as we go through, and then at the end, I'll try and go through those and answer those the best I can. So you should see a PowerPoint on the screen right now, and the topic that I'm going to talk through for just a few minutes today is some best practices for you folks that may be dealing with county fairs or state fairs, dealing in the wonderful livestock world of protests, appeals, and due process and how that might work. And then I'll follow up at the end, kind of applying that to some of our drug testing procedures that we do here in Iowa. So as we talk about protests, kind of some tips and tricks that we've learned kind of the hard way in Iowa, unfortunately. These are pulled directly from our State Fair premium book, portions of this. And so there is a full, it's about a one-page explanation in our State Fair premium book that talks about the protest process and then the appeals process and that sort of thing. So these are just some bullet points pulled from that to help you folks out and give you kind of some guidance as you go through this process. So as far as protests, what we do at our state fair is it must be filed within 24 hours of the completion of the show. So the individual or persons can't come back a week after, a month after, or 2 months after with a complaint of something that they feel was done wrong or rule was broken in a show that happened a long time ago. So that's one of the things. The person filing the protest must have competed in that same division or class of the show. So for instance, if they showed in the steer show or the beef show, they could file a protest, but not if they were a person exhibiting swine and had a complaint or saw something in the beef show. They have to have exhibited in that same division of that show. The person filing the protest typically pays a protest deposit fee, and this amount is obviously set by the fair. It can vary drastically to whatever they want to set that threshold at. In Iowa, ours is $250, and the reason behind that is to make it somewhat high enough for serious complaints and not just frivolous things that people are complaining about. And then obviously if that protest is sustained, then that $250 deposit is refunded to that particular individual. When they file a protest, the burden of proof falls on that person protesting. So they have to come up with whatever evidence or proof that they feel a rule infraction occurred or a code of ethics violation or some violation of the sort that happened. So they have to come up with the proof to prove that. As we move into the appeal process, again, this would be an individual or family that violated rule and they want to appeal whatever decision was made. So much like the protest process, the burden of proof, excuse me, then lies with that person who's appealing the disciplinary decision. So then they would have to come back with proof or a defense that they didn't violate a rule or that sort of thing. Typically, the way we do it at the state fair, they have 10 days after the decision was made to appeal that decision. So typically we'll initiate a letter to the family, or the fair would, excuse me, to that particular family, and then they would have 10 days to appeal that decision. The appeal must be in writing. That's something that we have. They can't do a telephone call or something like that. So it's pretty official that the appeal must be in writing. And just like the protest fee, we have an appeal deposit fee, again, of $250. And like I said before, that amount can vary for what the fair entity wants to set that at. And then if that appeal is sustained or approved, then that deposit fee is refunded as well. As we look at what we call a due process procedure, and this is something that we've learned how to work through and kind of dot our I's and cross our T's in some county situations that we've dealt with that have gone on to state fair action or eligibility and that sort of thing, is what we call the due process procedure. What this kind of entails is kind of I did a numbered type of thing as an example. So say you have a protest that is filed by an individual in writing, then that committee reviews that protest and may have that individual come in and talk to that group of people in person to state their case or their complaint and go through that protest with that particular committee. The committee then would invite what I call the accused individual or family to explain and defend their side. And this is basically what due process is. It's giving them a chance to defend themselves or explain their side of the story or defense if they didn't violate a particular rule or process. And that's an important thing that previously states have not done, and so that has gotten them into some trouble legal to make sure those families have that option to come in and state their case as well. This is kind of dependent on your state rules, probably as far as your code in your particular state. But from what I've gathered, at least at first, the person filing the protest can remain anonymous. Obviously, if it leads to a court case down the road and gets that far, obviously then they probably won't be able to remain that way if they're on a witness stand or anything like that. But at state fair, we've had some families that want to know who's making the accusation of the protest, and we have allowed that person to remain anonymous until a certain point if it gets to that far in the process. So this, what you see here, it's a lot of words, but I pulled that straight from our state fair premium book, and this is just some example verbiage that you folks could ponder and think about including. So these are some general considerations as far as this whole process goes along. So as we read through this, any and all participants in any and all events described in this premium book hereby acknowledge that they are voluntarily agreeing to participate in said event. Any and all participants in any and all events covered by this premium book hereby expressly acknowledge in a knowing and informed manner that the participant has no constitutional or statutory right to participate or compete in any and all events covered by this premium book, and that the participant shall abide by and is subject to all rules and procedures applicable to the event entered as stated in this premium book. So yes, that is a lot of words. To kind of boil it down in that first sentence where it talks about hereby acknowledging that they voluntarily agree to participate in said event. That's a key sentence, because what that is telling the exhibitors is they're voluntarily making entry. They don't have a right to enter a county fair, or state fair, or any livestock show. That's a privilege that by entering that show, they're agreeing to abide by the rules of that particular fair, and thus any consequences or rule infraction violations or discipline that might go with that. So that's a key sentence. And then beyond that, just, kind of talks about by making entry, they're fully aware that they're going to, be subject to any action should they violate a rule and that sort of thing. So it's just making them knowledgeable and informed that they don't have a right to enter that show. It's not a constitutional right, but they're voluntarily making the choice to enter that particular fair or exhibition. Another general consideration is to make sure to include wording, particularly in your premium book, of what committees or governing bodies that would discuss the issue or would come up with a final ruling. For example, many counties and state fairs have fair boards. Some at the county fair level here in Iowa, every county has an extension council. That's kind of our governing body for the extension side of things. A lot of our counties in Iowa have what they call a 4-H youth committee, which can involve kind of a combination of fair board members, extension council members, 4-H staff to combine to make a youth committee that kind of makes disciplinary decisions and actions at their fairs. It can also include 4-H or extension staff and other groups that you may have involved with your fair, but just to make sure that your exhibitors and families are aware of who does make that final decision. Where's the process that it goes? Does it start, with a superintendent and then go into the fair board, into an extension council, youth committee, and who ultimately has that final say on any disciplinary action or final ruling on that sort of thing. So, and it's best to be, upfront and communicate that well in your premium book, just so that everybody is aware and your families are aware of what that process looks like. So as we talk about disciplinary action itself, as I said before, be as specific as you can in your fair book about this. As an example, paragraph that could be included could be, XY County Fair reserves the right to place disciplinary action for rule or ethics violations, which can include, but is not limited to, withheld premiums and or sale money, present and or future participation or exhibition at the XY County Fair. Disciplinary action can be taken on the individual exhibitor or all exhibitors within a family. That last sentence is something that in Iowa, we typically do as far as a drug residue violation. If an exhibitor has a drug residue, they may get banned for a year or 2 or 3 or whatever that might be, but it's a ban placed on that entire family. So if they have older, younger siblings, it affects the family. And it also would go across 4-H, FFA, or open shows. So if they have a drug residue in the 4-H show, they can't come back next year and show in the open show or the FFA show. So the ban covers the whole family, siblings, as well as across different departments as far as 4-H, FFA, and open class. So that again is kind of particular to Iowa, and I don't know how other states, if they do something similar to that, but this would be an example of, as we talk about, being as specific as you can about kind of the consequences and things of that nature. So a lot of this has revolved around drug testing and positive drug residue results. And so as we talk about drug testing, some of the advantages of that is it tries to create a more level playing field, and knowing that it's kind of more proactive versus being reactive. Many times if exhibitors know that there's going to be drug testing, that alone hopefully can deter a lot of that from happening. And it also establishes a trust with a lot of the industry people and packers and that sort of thing that are constantly being, a little more apprehensive about purchasing fair show animals for their packers and things like that due to the risk of potential drug residues. Obviously, it has its challenges. It can be a high cost depending on what type of drug testing laboratory you use. And the disciplinary action, depending on if it's a first offense or the level of the drug or what kind of drug it was, can vary between how fairs want to handle that. If it's going to be a 1-year ban or a lifetime ban, or how strict they want to get with that, and what type of drug potentially was being used. Obviously, one key thing is to plan ahead. You want to make sure that you inform all the entities long before fair time and put that in your premium book where you list the rule that drug testing will occur, what that procedure is, and then obviously, as we talked about earlier, that appeal process, and make sure you put that in your premium book. You want to make sure you contact your particular testing lab ahead of time and to get the cost estimates and maybe compare a couple of different labs, and make sure you order your testing supplies, whether it's going to be urine samples or collecting blood samples and that sort of thing. Get all that obviously planned out and ahead of time before your fair happens. Some key components and rules and types of things, kind of some helpful tips that we do here in Iowa is we have exhibitors complete what we call an animal care disclosure form, and it's commonly referred to as our drug affidavit form. And this is for all of our meat animal species plus our horses, because we do drug testing on horses as well. So it basically lists all their medications and even their treatments to that animal from the time they purchased it to the arrival at the fair. And so this is very important that they write down pretty much anything and everything that they've given that administered to that animal. And that way, if it would show up on a drug test residue, if they mark that down, typically that was approved or administered by a vet. And so that wouldn't equate to any disciplinary action. But if they don't put that down and there's a drug residue, then there's going to be some issues. At the state fair, we tell exhibitors that once that animal arrives on the grounds, any and all medications to that animal have to be administered by the official fair vet. So in particular, it could be horses that maybe have some bute or banamine treatments and that sort of thing. Those have to be administered by the fair vet once they arrive on that fairground. So any treatment at all has to be approved and under the supervision of the fair vet. This is just kind of a screenshot of our animal care and disclosure statement or drug affidavit, and this particular one is for market beef. And so this talks about, I won't read through all this obviously, but it's on our website, and it just talks about how that individual is agreeing that they meet all of those food safety, quality assurance types of things. And then on the back side of that page, they will put down the animal's tag number and then any treatment records that was given to that animal throughout the year. And then we collect these down at the fair during check-in for each exhibitor. So as far as at the fair, just make sure your staff and volunteers know the process if you're doing any drug testing. Always have a parent or guardian and the youth exhibitor present during any collection of urine or blood. That's a very important process. And typically they have to sign off kind of as a witness that they were there and witness the veterinary staff or whoever you have collecting those samples be present. Follow the appropriate storage recommendations as far as if those samples need to be refrigerated and that sort of thing. And that last bullet there is the most key thing of all, is make sure your chain of custody is known and know who has had access or handled or transported any of those samples. Sometimes it's helpful to keep a log of that or a listing of staff or volunteers that have had access to that. At our state fair, we have locked coolers with padlocks and fridges that only a couple people have a key to. So it's very strict as far as that chain of custody goes, because if you're talking about disqualifying an animal, there's a lot of expense and input that those families have spent. And so they're going to argue anything they can potentially to find a loophole. And that's one of the things that a lot of folks ask is, who had access to the samples to tamper with those and that sort of thing. As far as positive test results, just make sure everybody's aware of what's legal, what's off label, et cetera. That's where we do our food safety quality assurance education, or our YQCA to youth, to make sure this is real world. And so it's important that we have a safe food supply. And so it's always good, especially on the swine side, we actually print what the withdrawal period for a lot of those medications or things that the packer that we've sold to has those withdrawal times listed. And we put that kind of in our exhibitor letter and on the website to make sure the exhibitors are aware of that as well. Again, have your disciplinary action in writing, whether that's going to be to withdraw premiums or a ban of future exhibitions and for how long. It's always good that folk kind of know what that potential could be. And then, as we talked about before, lay that appeal process out and a definitive timeline for those exhibitors. And again, a final decision process, whether that involves extension staff or fair board, extension council, youth committees, and all that types of things. Some things to think about as far as drug testing: who pays for those testing costs? Is that up to the fair? Is that cost built in to exhibitors? Are there certain substances that test positive of higher offense than others? That would be something to consider. And is there stronger disciplinary action for certain substances compared to something different? The thing to keep in mind is you always, once you decide something, that kind of has set a precedent. So in future years, if you try and increase that disciplinary action, you've kind of set a precedent, and families will refer back to that and say, well, you know, in 2018, they got banned a year, and now you're trying to ban us for 2 years. So a lot of things to keep in mind and consider. One of the things that we all obviously deal with is tampering, or in those overnight hours in barns, if animals are not under surveillance and a positive test comes up. Typically families are going to argue that, you know, someone else did it, put something in the feed or the water overnight. So it's important as a fair to have that discussion. Are security cameras needed, just to make sure that that argument can't be used if there's issues with the drug test? And with that, yeah, do others have the opportunity to drug an animal at the fair if there's no surveillance, or if folks are willing to sleep with those animals that they're worried about all night long? So just a couple of resources that I put up here. Our State Fair Premium, there's a couple of links there. That top link has that full protest and appeals process written out, and so you can go to that. It's under the general rules link of that particular website listed here. And then our Iowa State 4-H State Fair Livestock website also lays out that procedure as well. I put our Iowa State Vet Diagnostic Laboratory link up here too. That's in past years who we've utilized for our state fair drug testing, and some of the county fairs in Iowa that have had to implement some drug testing procedures use those folks as well. So that's all I have there. I'm going to stop sharing the presentation and pull up the chat pod if folks have questions to type in there. And while you're thinking about that, I'm going to launch a poll. Hopefully, if you can see that. If you want to type in the answers to your questions, as you're thinking about that, and if you want to type a question that I didn't cover, please feel free to do so in that chat box. So if you want to fill out that poll, those poll questions. And this recording will be posted on the University of Nebraska website. So folks that weren't able to tune in live today will have access to this PowerPoint and the recording as well. All right, Amy's got a question. One of the things we've heard over the years is I didn't know about that rule. Sometimes it's a new rule, sometimes it's not. This happens even after the rule book link is sent out by email and made available online. How do you advise fair boards, livestock committees when exhibitors or families make an accusation of not being made aware of rules? Typically in Iowa, we try and stress to families that the state fair book usually is posted online by April 1st. And so from April until August, the the burden is on the families, and that's kind of an excuse that in Iowa doesn't fly too far, because it's their responsibility to make sure they're aware of the rules for that particular fair or exhibition. So if there's anything new or changed, we do try and put that kind of in a Word document. Here's some new rule changes or updates for 2020, to make sure there's any changes. But typically it's the family's responsibility to make sure they're aware of those rules and that sort of thing. We have kind of a running joke in Iowa that rule number 1 is nobody reads. You can print it 20 different places, and then you'll still have people that claim they didn't see it. Other questions from the group? Looks like most folks have filled out the poll. Okay. Amy, did you have anything else to announce for the group? I talked about this would be uploaded to the website. And also on that website, I think we've got the future dates for upcoming meetings as well.
For 2020, we're planning on having webinars in March, June, September, and December. So we should have those topics and speakers posted and sent out to you guys soon.
Okay, sounds good. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions in there, so I'll go ahead and stop the recording, and I want to thank everybody for tuning in today, and hopefully you learned something new. Obviously, if you have questions, shoot me an email or give me a phone call if you've got specific questions related to your fair. And again, hopefully this was helpful, and wish everybody a great rest of the week.